Alan, we were just saying that Mark is a very careful builder of his story, that he takes material that he didn't invent, but puts it together in ways that are interesting and illuminating. And now suddenly, as we come to the end of chapter 5 and move into chapters 6 and 7, to me as a reader and as one who's tried to teach the gospel, this is hard because it seems like it's kind of one thing after another. Here's a story, here's another story. Was that just that moment where he had a barrel full of stories he had to get in and said, all right, I better get onto this before I get back to my main plot?
Yeah, for a long time, people who study the New Testament for a living kind of classed Mark as just a collector who liked to plop things in. And we have seen evidence against that in the first part of the book, but this is one of the places where they, kind of their exhibit A.
Right.
Because you've got, in this next section, in chapters 6 and 8, you've got 2 feeding stories within 10 minutes of an orally presented gospel. And so people thought this was clumsy. They thought Mark is just throwing in the kitchen sink.
Yeah.
And between those two are these sort of loosely connected, or at least seemingly loosely connected, episodes of a Syrophoenician woman and of healing and the
disputes about cleanliness.
And so this is one of the sort of case studies or exhibits that narrative folks who think this is a story from beginning to middle to end, have to look closely at.
Right.
And what I would like to sort of start thinking about together as a way of doing that is asking after these 2 feeding stories, because they bracket this section and they lie out there as possible evidence that he is clumsy.
Yeah.
And I wonder though if Mark's not clever again here in putting them back to back. We saw early in the first 3 chapters that Mark had a synagogue scene with a man who has a demon, and a synagogue scene with a man with a withered hand within 2 chapters of one another. And in the second one, he said again, this is happening. This time again, with the bread, with the feedings, we have a first episode in chapter 6 where Jesus feeds 5,000 people, and then we have a second episode in 8 where he feeds a similar number of people. And the second one is prefaced with again. Right? So the narrator seems to be wanting to throw our eyes
Remember
back.
that.
And so the thought that this is Mark not remembering what he just put in is kind of dispelled by the use of that connector. And in the second episode, very oddly, having seen Jesus 10 minutes ago, he give 5,000 people enough food to eat all they want and leftovers. The disciples say, "Woo! What are we going to do? How are we going to feed these people?
This is terrible. They're all hungry."
We didn't expect company.
I know.
And the question then becomes: is this just Mark throwing something in, or is Mark trying to say something about the disciples? We saw last time that part of what's going on after the parables and in that section leading up to this is an extension to those who are outside to come in. And you mentioned in that context that we're going to see a little bit of a play on whether the disciples are inside or not.
Exactly.
And here we get disciples who have been with Jesus, who watch him, calm a storm, who watch him throw out demons here, there, and everywhere, who watch him now.
Hear about a dead woman, watch a dead woman, so watch the dead girl get up.
All kinds of things that are just beyond phenomenal. He's walked on water here in this passage, and they get to all those things, including a feeding 10 minutes ago, and they ask, how in the world are we going to do this? That's got to be a Markan or a narrative attempt to characterize the fact that these disciples weren't quick on the uptake, right? That they somehow were missing something here. And that's going to become differently important down the line. They're missing something about bread and feeding now, but we're going to see them continue to miss things.
Miss other things.
And so I think that, to start, is an important part of why these 2 would be back to back.
All right.
Additionally, one of the questions is why these specific things between, why the specific episodes that happen between the 2 feedings. Okay, I'll go with you, says the skeptic. I'll go with you that these 2 are intentionally put as sort of posts there and cross-referenced. But why this Syrophoenician woman? Why the purity stuff? How does all that fit? And you had a thought that you told me once about why the Syrophoenician woman in the context of this bread stuff. And I just find it not only interesting, but I find it a good explanation that we hear about bread in the Syrophoenician woman's story.
Right.
Syrophoenician, Gentile, outsider, right, who begs Jesus to help her.
Right.
And Jesus says, "I got to feed the children first,
before the dogs."
Right.
Yeah.
And then she says, even the dog gets to lick
Right.
up the scraps.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
Bread coming off the table, bread left over.
Yeah.
So throughout this section, we're seeing bread and bringing people in through it. I like that. Can you any reflection on that as a picture
the other
of what's
place
going on?
where that picks up is a man named Austin Farrer, who went through the Gospel of Mark finding numerologies that include everything. You always want to know how many there was of anything, and then he had some deeply mystical meaning. Right. And he managed to make the Gospel of Mark more puzzling than it was before he got a hold of it, which is a real gift because it's puzzling enough before Austin got a hold of it. But what he's always persuaded me of is at the end of the second feeding, he asks how many baskets there were in each case. Jesus says to the disciples, "Don't you understand? How many baskets after the first feeding?" Answer is 12. Right. How many baskets after the second feeding? Answer is 7. And Farrer goes through an elaborate, but on the page at least, kind of persuasive argument that the 12 is symbolic of the 12 tribes of Israel, and the first feeding of the 5,000 shows that in Jesus Christ, God feeds Israel. Right. That the second is symbolic of the perfect number in a Gentile world, that the 7 baskets are the leftovers for the Gentiles, and that Mark is saying that this God, represented in Jesus Christ, feeds the hunger of the Jews first, absolutely, just what Jesus is about to say to the Syrophoenician woman, but also plenty of bread left over for the Gentiles. Right. Syrophoenician woman comes and says, "I want bread." Jesus says, "Kids first." And she says, "Okay, but there are going to be leftovers, aren't there?" He says, "Well said, madam." We may come back to that. Right. That's a really interesting passage. Right. He says, "Well said, madam. You can have some bread too." And we've been talking about the way in which this kingdom keeps getting bigger and bigger. Lepers come in, apparently unclean people come in, synagogue leaders come in, outcasts come in, demoniacs come in. Now the Gentiles are coming in. Right. And suddenly kingdom of God is really not just kingdom of Israel any longer. Right. It's God's reign over all creation. And I think the two stories are there partly to tell us that, and so is the Syrophoenician woman.
And piggybacking on that, that makes good sense of the purity conversation, because in the purity conversation, Jesus challenges this really excluding detail of Jewish ceremonial law. Right? The disciples get criticized for eating when they haven't washed sufficiently, and Mark, in a moment when he lets us see his audience a little bit, says, this is what the Jews do as a practice. This is and spends a sentence and a half on that. Yep. And then Jesus says that it's not what goes in that corrupts, it's what comes out of a person, which is a universal truth rather than a specific religious truth. Exactly. And so if the Syrophoenician woman represents a coming in and a getting bigger, the vehicle by which that can happen seems to come in the story of purity. Right? That Jesus is making way for people who would formerly not have thought themselves to
not be allowed in.
Have access.
Yeah, not be allowed in. And it's a great reminder to us, because at least, my history is all Gentile as far as I can trace the family back. We were a bunch of Gentiles. We're the latecomers. Right? We're the surprises. We're the dogs under the table. No question Judaism had a way in. Israel was set in important ways. We're the surprise. And then I take that when I'm in a more preachy mode to say, okay, what surprising people are there out there now that we've decided are cultically unclean, or not quite up to our standards, or not quite what we expect of Christian people. And where is Jesus surprisingly saying to us, bread for them too? Yeah. This is not just bread for you.
Yeah, so the widening isn't done.
The widening is still going on all the time.
And so Paul says to the Jew first and also to the Greek in Romans, he says to he tries to talk about how Gentiles are grafted into a Jewish tree. This is Mark kind of doing that.
This is Mark kind of doing that. Mark opening up to the larger world. Yeah.
Yeah, and then we, in our day, try to find who the larger world is.
Yeah. Yeah. So do you make any connections between the feeding as a kind of symbolic statement about what God does and the way in which we deal with people in genuine need today? I mean, is there Is there any combination between this and a hungry world?
There's a place in the first feeding where it says Jesus looked on them with compassion because he saw that they were like sheep without a shepherd, right? The world seems to have produced in Jesus, and the needs of the world seems to have produced in Jesus a pang, right? A pang, and in this case, just physical need. Not even, we don't need to go to a metaphorical or a spiritualization of this. This is just, people are hungry, and I feel bad for them that they are. That's got to reflect on our day. And the fact of the abundance that is shown in both feedings, from little comes much, again. The fact of that abundance that is brought forth when compassion is exercised has to also reflect on what is possible in our time for people of this Christ who look at a world and feel pangs. There's got to be some sense that the one who gave abundantly then and provided abundantly then will somehow equip us to do the same.
And not let us off the hook.
Not let us off the hook. It's our job now. And that, I mean, it goes back to, and we keep running this thread, but it goes back to the first line, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God.
So how do we continue? One way we continue is to think about, what does compassion look like? What does feeding look like?
Right. How does this look now? And it's our turn, it's our baton, right? It's been passed on.
Reflect for a minute or two on this thing you have pointed out to us and that we're beginning to notice, which is the disciples looking more and more like outsiders. Why is Mark, I mean, this is the blessed St. Peter, the blessed St. James, the blessed St. John. Here I am, they've probably gone to their heavenly reward by now. Everybody around me says we're supposed to love these guys. Why does Mark tell a story about the ones we would have thought were the great heroes of the church and show them being just dense time after time after time?
Yeah, and it's going to get worse.
And it's going to get worse.
I mean, right now it's sort of information problems. Later it's going to be nature of discipleship problems. So it's going to get worse. When I picture myself in Mark's, in the living room as Mark's gospel is read out to some people for the first time, I picture myself wanting to think that those people are more powerful, more courageous, more clever, so I can be inspired by them. So if I'm, we talked earlier about finding characters in the gospel with whom we relate, right? Where do we find ourselves in the gospel? I think everybody in the room at some level is going to find the disciples and say, I'm looking at them. I'm keen on them, and I'm going to find a clue for my life. And the strategy of undermining that or undermining the disciples in this story is a striking phenomenon in light of that. Mark had to know that his people would be looking at the disciples.
Right.
And so how is he, and I think we're going to get more about this as the gospel goes on, but how is he using that strategically as a part of his way of bringing this gospel? Namely, these are clay-footed people. What value has that is a question we're going to have to get back to later in the book, I think. But right now, it's just presented as a question. It's kind of astonishing.
The kind of somewhat flat-footed explanation is Mark just didn't like those people. Right? That he lives in a time where they were annoying to him. He wants to be a different kind of church. He thinks there's all too much stress on the original circle of the apostles, and he's just going to show how wrong they were about everything. I suspect there's something more subtle going on than that.
I do too, and I think it has again to do with this being the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ.
And then the question becomes, with whom do we identify? And maybe it'll turn out to be not so much the famous ones as the lesser-known ones. The Jairus' daughter, the woman who reaches out, the person who cries, "Help me, Jesus," and not, "Hello, here I am, the blessed St. Peter, I'm on a roll."
Yeah, there is in this, Marianne Tolbert's book traces out and finds people who for one episode hold faith and says these are good soil. That always rubbed me a little bit the wrong way because they didn't have to stay around. They didn't have to, the sun didn't come and scorch. And so I wonder, as we follow disciples and see them trailing off and running away and being lacking courage down the line, I wonder what we're supposed to see as the remedy for that.
Yeah, me too.
Because the individual, I think we can all think that if we had somebody and asked him to come heal our dying daughter, and he came and healed our dying daughter, we could probably be faithful for a minute. what happens when the longitude gets
Yeah.
carried in
Yeah.
is an important question in this book,
Yeah.
and we'll be able to come back to that later down the road.
I hope there's hope. I hope we find some places where we can sink our seed into the soil and think we're okay.
Yeah, yeah, because if it's just like us, that's not great news. If the last word is Peter and Andrew and James and John and the guys end up just like us,
Right.
forever
Or
and
we're going to
always,
end up just like them.
or
Yeah.
why are we reading this book?
And why is it called a gospel?
Yeah. Why is it good news?
Thank you.
Yeah.